Good evening. Hello to everyone.
Good evening. Hello
Welcome
to everyone.
to the day 2.
Welcome to the day 2.
Welcome of our web talk series on social impact of COVID-19, Indo-German Perspectives. My name is Adishri Jamkedkar. I am the program manager for the German Center for Research and Innovation here in New Delhi, and I welcome you all to the event today. We've got speakers from India and Germany joining us today to speak about the very crucial and very crucial topic which we cannot avoid to speak about in this time today, and get comparative perspectives from India and Germany on it. This talk has been organized together with the supporters of the German Center for Research and Innovation, which are University of Cologne, University of Göttingen, the Bavarian Indian Center for Business and University Cooperation, and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation here. The representatives of all these institutes are present here as well, and were responsible for also co-organizing this talk with us. So thank you so much to all of those as well. To the audience who's joining in, welcome. Thanks for taking interest in this talk. And a couple of technical instructions for you before we move ahead with the topic. You see on your tool window a chat option. This is the way you can interact with the speakers or with the organizers if you want to ask certain questions, if you want to engage in discussions, and also if you have any technical trouble, please feel free to write in this chat option. This is the only way you will be able to interact with us. Unfortunately, there is no audio or video available for the participants. The speakers are also welcome to interact with you in this chat window. Before we move forward, I would like to quickly introduce the German Center for Research and Innovation. We are a network of about 18 German research organizations, universities, funding bodies, and research-based companies present in India. It is funded by Germany's Federal Foreign Office and is managed by the German Academic Exchange Service. We have 5 such centers all over the world. And in India, we promote the German research landscape and also enhance research cooperation between India and Germany, and facilitate networking between scientific and research communities and stakeholders in research and innovation. And now I would like to introduce the moderator of this event, which is Professor Prabhu Prasad Mohapatra, who is a professor at the University of Delhi and has research interests in history of labor and working classes, history of Indian diaspora, economic history of modern India, transnational labor history, and long-distance labor migration. He will be chairing this session today, and with us we have speakers joining from JNU, University of Göttingen, University of Cologne, and University of Würzburg, namely Professor Sucharita Sen, Professor Dr. Ravi Ahuja, Dr. Susanne Brandstetter, and Dr. Samita Sen. I will hand it over here to Professor Mohapatra to introduce the topic and take up the panel discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Hello, thank you, Adishri. Thank you, everyone. I first welcome my co-panelists. It's a wonderful occasion to be together in some sense and to discuss issues which are very close to our concerns, scholarly as well as citizens of the world and citizens of our respective countries. I think migration, like nothing else or no other topic, brings out the tensions inherent in all these issues of being a citizen of the world, but also a citizen of being very locally embedded, but also having, because of work, because of your concerns, being connected to much wider worlds. So migration, as we know, has been quite central to the formation of not just modern nation states. I would say that It was in fact quite central to formation of modern states, both European as well as in colonial states, ex-colonial states. But you know, it's somehow in some senses it's been underplayed, and for various reasons, as we shall see, it has been seen as a problem and something which had to be actually to be sorted out or to be solved, but nothing prepared us. That means us means scholars as well as policymakers to something which happened when the COVID-19 struck. And to that extent, I just wanted to point out that the massive scale in which we saw of the conditions of labor and migrant labor within India was unique in many ways, excepting perhaps something similar to what happened in China. In terms of scale, perhaps China was more, but this amount of people suddenly becoming visible as and carrying their identity as migrants was a completely a new phenomenon. It in some sense brought forward the questions of how they have been hidden from policy perspectives. It became clear that policymakers had not at all taken into account both the quantity, nor had they or seemed to have not much idea about the relationship and qualitative aspects of their work and work relations, and the possible impact of their policy actions on them. So, given the fact, and I would put it up like this, that the migration phenomenon that we saw, however we may characterize it, it has been characterized as reverse migration, because now we see about 30 million people, or perhaps more. 20 to 30 is what we 30 million people moved back from cities, and maybe more from smaller towns, which we don't actually have any idea or we do not have much idea about. Now, if this was the scale at which this migration happened, or people, and it certainly became visible, and it's given its unique character, it brought together a series on our world. So the migrant crisis, or let's call it for the moment migrant crisis, brings out all the fault lines which are there and which becomes visible through this manifestation of this crisis, of the migrant crisis. The fault lines become visible and we also need to understand what will be possible changes which will happen, and the social impact of this COVID pandemic. I think it's a very migrant crisis provides us a window to understand much larger issues, not just much beyond the question of migration itself. With this, I would like to ask each of my panelists to speak for 2 minutes about themselves and their work, before I ask each one of them in their order to reflect on what we would call the migrant crisis in the way. Maybe they can then speak. First, I would like to begin with myself. I'm Prabhu Mahapatra. I teach history, economic history and labor history at Delhi University, and I have a long-standing interest in the history of migration, especially indentured migration, and I also do work on the history of informal sector and informal labor relations. These are the two areas in which I specialize in. And I'm also part of a group of labor historians of India formed around an association of Indian labor historians. And I have interest in, as you can make out from not just migration history, but also in the global impact of labor and labor migration. Thank you. Maybe we can have Susan speaking now. Susan and Ravi and Sucharita and Samita. in this hour.
My name is Susanne Brandstetter. I'm a professor of the anthropology of globalization at the University of Cologne. My field of research has been China and the Chinese world. And most recently, I had an interest also in Chinese globalization, right? China's presence also outside of China, Africa, Asia, etc., etc. And my own, I have not worked on migration issues straight onwards, but I have, of course, worked on questions of justice and family relations in China, and both in Taiwan and in China. And of course have mostly worked in the countryside, most recently also a bit in the city, but mostly in the countryside, and of course have been come across the issue of migration constantly, because not only in Taiwan, where our first fieldwork was located, where most of the young people actually going to the city in Taiwan, the cities in Taiwan to work in factories. That was in the 1990s, and the families depended very much on that kind of work. Later on, I was working in southeastern China and northeastern China at a time when already many people from the countryside had to go to the cities to find work because they could not generate enough income in the countryside anymore after certain economic changes that happened in China in the 1980s. So migration has always been part of the families I worked in, and the villages I worked in, where much being experienced the problems and the issues connected with rural-urban migration in China.
Maybe Ravi.
Yeah, hello, I'm Ravi Ahuja. I teach labor history and Indian social history at the University of Göttingen in Germany. So I'm basically linked perhaps to this panel through two research interests. So one research interest refers to the issue of circulation in society. And here I've worked on one of the early globally circulating workforces, that is seafarers, particularly Indian seafarers in the late 19th and in the early 20th century. But I've also been interested in the structures of circulation in space and so the infrastructures of circulation in colonial India. The second research interest is closely connected to the work of Prabhu. That is the question of the processes of informal.
Professor Sen, Sucharita Sen.
Yeah, so I teach in the Center for Study of Regional Development in JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. I am a geographer. I am an economic geographer, so I teach economic geography, and among other things, I also teach agriculture, natural resources, and rural livelihoods. So that is also the broad area of my concern, but for the last 10 years, I've been working on labor and gender issues, and I have not worked on migration at all, barring, other than the larger issue of labor, where of course migration is an important concern, but they have focused on rural labor more than urban labor. However, my initial interest has been peri-urban areas, and that is where I have dealt with interaction of urban and the rural. So I was 2 years very recently, 2016 to 18, I was in organization called Saki Waters, South Asia Consortium for Interdisciplinary Water Resource Studies. And there I actually, dealt with water as a prime area of interest, and water and gender and labor.
Yeah. Professor Samita Sen. Yeah. Samita, would you just quickly introduce?
Hi, what are the odds
Yes.
that in a panel
Can
of
you hear me?
5 people you have 2 Professor at just to cause more confusion? Can you hear me?
Samita, if you can raise your microphone a bit. I think I can't. It's too soft.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I teach history. Can you hear me now?
I teach history at the University of Cambridge, and my work has been on gender and labor. My focus has been to in terms of migration, I've done work on rural-urban migration and on indentured migration, like Professor Mahapatra. And my endeavor has been to show how looking at gender changes how we have looked traditionally at migration. Most of my work has been on the colonial period, northern India. But I have also in recent years looked at many contemporary issues which are to do with gender, informality, but also trade unions and organization of labor.
I think now what I would like is we have had some discussions amongst ourselves about certain broad areas that we would like to take on. Questions about the magnitude of the migration, questions around questions of visibility and invisibility of labor, and the link to formal and informal sector, that most of the migrants were in informal sector, and the questions of that, and about family, gender, questions of migration and gender, and also on history of migration. But the contemporary the massive flow of migration from the cities back to villages. What were the earlier histories of such pandemics? If we can briefly discuss that. And finally, if we get chance, we should discuss about what will be the possibility, what will happen to migration, or what will happen to these migrants or questions of migrations in the future, given that the world of work is poised to be, in some ways, was already being transformed by forces of technology as well as changes in organizations of production. Now, with this, will it change? What will happen to that? And in that context, what we can think about migration in the context of future of work. So these are broad questions. I would ask my panelists, my co-panelists, to reflect on this, and they have reflected in their work in many ways on all these questions, and to speak for, like, say, 5 to 7 minutes on it, and then we can have questions. So we would speak, each of us will speak, or each of you will speak for 5 to 7 minutes on the theme that you think are important on this. I don't need to specify that one of the understanding is we need to be deeply comparative. We can't just be talking about what's happening in India, but to have some sense of what's happening around the world, especially if we can bring in questions or whatever little that we know in relation to the phenomenon of migration and issues around it elsewhere. Oh, of course. As I had told in the beginning, one issue which we would like to bring is the way the question of migration, though it is largely what we see is internal migration in India right now, at least that becomes very evident, though there is a lot of external migration issues also involved here. We would like to focus around the question of migration and question of citizenship. So I would ask my panelists to reflect on and choose what they would like to focus in order to. It is possible that we can do what we can do is let each one speak and then have some questions, or that perhaps is better, that each of us speaks, or each of you speak for about 6 to 7 minutes each, and we have a second round afterwards. After I will ask certain questions around it, and after the second round, maybe we'll open it up for discussions with the outside. And then Sucharita, and then Susan. So Samita, I would suggest, I would ask you to still go up to the mic. The mic is visible on your top layer, and then next to it is, and then adjust. If you click next to it, you will have adjust microphone. Then raise the volume. It was still a bit soft when you were talking. And yeah. Yeah.
I couldn't hear the order that you gave. So am I supposed to speak now? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there are two issues that I would flag in the 5-6 minutes that I've been asked to speak. One is this characterization of what happened in India at the end of March as reverse migration. And I think really if we put it in the context of longer patterns of migration, then what really it represented was not reverse migration, but an aspect of circulation, an emergency expression of circulation that has been part of the inalienable part of rural-urban migration in India for at least 2 centuries that we know. And the thing to emphasize here is, at the time when it happened, between say end of March and early May, a lot of predictions were made by scholars as well as other observers that this is a reverse migration, this is a radical loss of trust of workers, employers, the city has failed the workers, and these are workers that are never going to come back to the city. And this raises a question about how particular sectors in the city would function going forward. In fact, this has proven to be completely misplaced because even before lockdown began, we began to unlock, so to speak. The reverse migration began to reverse. People who had returned to the village began to now again return. They did the amount of effort, the walking, the distress, the mortality. Despite all that, people also started to begin to make enormous effort to come back to the city. That is because the reasons why they had in the first place migrated to the city had not gone away. The village is not capable of sustaining the population that was seeking to return to it. So we have to understand, there's been a lot of debate in the scholarship about whether the city is the buffer to the village or the village is the buffer to the city. The point is that they are both linked, and they're both linked by this phenomena of circulation of workers. And if we don't understand what is the nature both of the agrarian economy and the urban economy which causes this circulation, then we will not be able to put this reverse migration in the context it ought to be put. The second issue that I would like to flag is that visually, this is the first time the Indian middle class, though we are obviously in cities directly consumers of migrant labor, we don't usually acknowledge it, recognize it. It's not part of our world, of our understanding of our world. And it was for the first time visually we were hit with it. So it became a part and also part of a media. In that context, there was a sudden awareness of migrant labor. And one aspect of this migrant labor that we became aware of because it affected our daily life was the domestic work sector. It is the figures of migrants, as Professor Mahapatra has already said, are very strange. So we have had estimates from 40 million to 14 million. To 140 million, which means that the range of numbers is such that the numbers are virtually meaningless, which means actually that we don't know the number of migrant workers we have in our cities. But to whatever extent these numbers are of any meaning, the two highest categories, the most numerous categories that have been identified, one is construction workers, which is about 50 to 70 million, and domestic workers, which is about 30 to 50 million. So one of the remarkable and most, and I think this is across the world, one of the things that was impacted by the pandemic and the lockdowns that followed was domestic work. And in India, given the dependence of urban middle class households on paid domestic work, this absence, I would say, became suddenly very, very prominent. And it is only when it suddenly went away that people realized the scale of their dependence on it. And also it was brought to our notice that a very large proportion of these workers are migrant workers. And if we look at that phenomena, this is we can talk at length about this, and if there are questions, we can take this, take many aspects of it. But I will flag two things. What this migrant crisis brought to fore is two changes that has been happening in our rural-urban migration pattern. One is the earlier, when women accompanied migrant families in rural-urban migration, what we call family migration, it is the certainty or the likelihood of the man's job that led the family migration. But now, because of domestic work and the importance of domestic work in the urban economy, family migrations are often led by the woman's job. So the informal network of jobs, one family comes to the city, finds a job, then the woman tells her sister, you come to the city, I'll get you a job as a domestic worker. And it's the women's networks that often lead family migration, which is a very new thing. We have not earlier seen women-led family migration. The second important thing is we now see in Indian cities single women migrants. Not single women migrants of the type we have seen in the colonial period, which are women who are ejected from the community or the village in the community or the family in the village, and therefore come to the city in order to settle. But another kind, this is the woman migrant who is very like the male migrant, a married woman who has family back in the village, who comes to the city to work as a live-in domestic worker, primarily as a live-in domestic worker. There are other jobs as well, a range of jobs which are nowadays called care work, but not only domestic work. So you now have a proliferation, for instance, of cleaning, non-domestic cleaning jobs in the hospitality sector, in the hospital sector, in malls and retail sector, Though it is to be noted that cleaning jobs in the non-domestic setting tend still to be preponderantly male, there is an increasing presence of women in that sector too. So you have certain kinds of informal work, new kinds of informal work, and some old kinds of informal work, which a different category of women are accessing now. So put together, you have a higher number of women migrating. You also have a higher visibility of women migrating in the rural-urban migration context.
It's very
and
interesting
these
that
have become
Samita, who has worked
been thrown
earlier
up
on and had actually pointed out in her earlier work that the fact that most of migration in the colonial period, at least for 100, and even till now it is still, has always been predominantly male migration. Of course, and to show that why it is so, why the gendered aspect of migration, didn't mean that women are not laboring, though they might say that we're going for marriage. Most of the migration, this is the paradox of migration, that most of the migrants in India are women, but most of them say that they migrated because of marriage. But this is obviously was a way in which the labor of women was not accounted for. The fact that marriage is a way in which even labor was mobilized. And her earlier work showed very clear connection between the rural work by women and men working in the cities, and the connection, the household was stretched between the countryside, and that apart from other things she has done, this is very important. But I wanted to point out and to Sucharita, to ask Sucharita, Professor Sucharita Sen, because of the point Samita Sen made right now has to be placed in a long-term change. In the sense, she pointed out the shift which is happening, which is very much clear, as you would say, Sucharita, about that at least from 2001 to 2011, the census, intercensal period, had seen a change, not only quantitative shift in the number of migrants, but also for the first time an increasing proportion of women coming for economic migration. So that means, and some of these are, of course, exactly the kind of point which Samita had said. But there is a second aspect to it. For about hundreds of years, from 1881 till 1961 at least, Sucharita, would you agree that what we know as the structural transformation or movement of people going from agriculture to industry seemed to have stalled, or it was roughly the same amount of proportion of people, so roughly 70% of the people were still in agriculture. 70, it had gone down to 60 by 1981. And the slow rate of structural transformation was something which was bemoaned. And then we saw a massive increase in what we know as a real depletion of the agricultural labor. That due to the agrarian crisis, large number of people leaving agriculture. So on the one hand, Samita has pointed to the circulant aspect of it, the circulation aspect of it, which is an old pattern, and millions of people, and how much. But I would like you to comment on these two aspects, increasing, let's call it for the moment, feminization of the migrant stream, which has important consequences, and the agrarian crisis and the link with the scale of migration, also the character of migration. Thank you.
Yeah. By saying that, the kind of actually, what we have, as Samita was saying, that the visibility is what is special this time. I mean, we've suddenly become aware of the migrants general middle class person has seen these visuals of the media being shown. But having said that, the media has actually, I think it has been a very apolitical coverage of the whole thing by and large. But that did not stop any of us from generally sympathizing with the plight of the migrant. But to understand this, as probably you were pointing out, it is something which was always there, and it is a part of, it just made us see something which existed, and we will not be able to understand this unless and until we see it is just playing out as it was for the last 20 years, let me say. In fact, it is a continuation of that. But let me first comment on this, since we are talking about India and Germany. In India, we are seeing pandemic playing out in a very, very unequal society. So let us first flag that issue, and the way the disease has traveled is pretty much the same way as foreign direct investments have traveled. So as a result of globalization, the kind of channels that you have had, and in India, if you saw the red-green zone maps in the initial period, you would have seen that, it is concentrated, it started from the cities which were connected by the air and so on and so forth. And these are the places where most of the interstate migrants are there, but within the city spaces, they occupied a very different kind of space. And we have to budget with this, that there were completely unequal burdens of dealing with the pandemic, whether it be the ability to maintain distance, ability to ensure physical and economic access to food and other essentials, taking benefits from work from home like we did. None of this was available to them, and they face, most of them, we are talking about the informal sector workers, they almost wholesale lost their job with very little savings. So that is the first thing. The second is, from a recent work which Prabhu is aware of, which I have done with a large team, and I was just part of it, I would draw, so what we did was we surveyed about 1,400 odd workers in various places in India between April and May. And I'm trying to draw from there not what happened in April and May, but what we have learned as to the character of migration from there. So the first thing which came out is that this circulation bit, everybody does not participate in it. So it depends on the number of years that a migrant has migrated for, and number two, it also depends on whether they've migrated with family. Very large number of them are still single male migrants, and I'm quoting the larger census data. Till now, 2011 is the latest data that we have. 15% of the employment-driven migration are women. Rest of them are all men. So 85% men and 15% women is what we have now. Now the three reasons due to which we saw this, if we call it reverse migration, what we saw, the phenomena we saw, but it is not new. It was there even before, it was not visible to us as such. First reason was the social connects with their homes, villages and states. In this, there are interstate migrants and intrastate migrants, and what we found in our work that the interstate migrants are much more vulnerable than the intrastate migrants who were located in their larger, language zone and similar kind of a space that we were used to. The second, and I want to put a little bit of emphasis on this, is from 2010 onwards, there has been an increasing, if you so-called reverse migration, temporary phenomena of that, due to participation in agricultural activities which are related with labor peaks like sowing and harvesting. This was always there, but it has increased quite a bit in the recent years, or that is what the NSSO figures tell us. So, and the third thing is that the need for supplementary finances. Ironically, for these migrant laborer, and this I'm talking about March and April and post-pandemic, has come from the village, not from the urban area. So this, ironically, the so-called rich urban area has been incapable of supporting this minimum credit needs that they had to buy food if they were not provided ration, that has come from their own villages. So these were the three major things which drove the river circulation. Now, I would like to comment on what did this mean for the informal urban workspace. Number one is that most of the migrants, at least particularly the ones who had recently migrated, say 5 years or less or 6 years or less, were extremely isolated in the urban. So they were not part of a large urban network, so to say, and that kind of support was practically not there. So much so that the NGOs, very well-meaning NGOs who were trying to distribute food, found it very difficult to actually connect to them. The second is that this increasing need for supplementary income came with increase in wage rates which were less than the increase in inflation, zero social security in the urban workspaces. According to our study, 3% got EPF, another 2.5% got some kind of medical support, and this tiny minuscule people lost less jobs compared to others. So, and as I was saying, that the intrastate migrants were the most vulnerable, and in our, the kind of study which we did, even though they earned the most within this very limited range of 5,000 to 15,000, they were towards 15,000, but this did not make them less vulnerable. This was not at all adequate for them to have any kind of a saving.
You can.
Now, should I stop here, or I can go on for 2 more minutes? Okay, so I would like to then comment on, with this backdrop, like to comment on the political nature of the kind of migration that we saw, which boils down to the relationship between labor and the capital, and the way this has played out over a period of time, because every time, so I would like to refer you to the World Development Report 2009, as far back as that we say that we have no planning of any sort, because in the neoliberal period that might be true of public expenditures and where they are spent, and that we are more privatized and so on and so forth. But as far back as that, it was actually charted out very carefully that there would be unequal investments, and these investments would be there in the large cities. Migration would be the vehicle which would follow the capital investment, and this is the way, and it is okay to have, in fact it was stated in this report that it's okay to have a little bit of disparity here and there. Now, following that and larger, the way India has sort of progressed, or the economic regime has progressed, we see absolute curtailment of investments in agriculture. So as a result of that, now the larger agrarian distress, which is there for a decade almost now, and a little more than that, has to be linked with this larger policy. As Samita was saying, that it's not as if, so when we were interviewing the workers, many of them said that we don't want to go back. We have faced humiliation, we have absolutely nothing, at least we will get food if we go back, so we are not sure we want to come back. Now the reason why we see them going back is not because they want to go, but there is a situation where it is entirely distress migration of sort, and they are being pushed out of the villages. However, having said that, one more little point that I wish to make, which is related to a work which I have done, is that we have been surprisingly, in spite of the male selective out-migration largely, we have been seeing a defeminization in Indian agriculture from 50% work participation rate to 30% work participation rate. Now, I won't go into the detail because I don't have time, but what I'm saying now is that this pulling out has not been because they are richer now. It is more from the poorer family who have pulled out of work in agriculture, and this is likely to become worse because the kind of unemployment situation that we have currently, kind of economic downturn that we have, I'm not sure how many of the male migrants would be accommodated in the urban workspace as earlier, and the defeminization in the rural India that we see is likely to be aggravated. So I'm going.
Is already a cue to for you to reflect on or to tell us about. First, in a sense, the point she made that it is a political migration. Migration is never a purely an economic phenomenon, not like a natural phenomenon. Because of merely because of disparity of wages, people just don't move only because of that. It has always been linked to ways of regulation of migration, whether it has been informally done or formally done. So, in a sense, something which Arvind Subramaniam, the Chief Economic Advisor of India, in a very, because that's the first time migration was put centrally, or at least put as an important part of economic survey in 2016-17, had mentioned that despite hundreds of years of migration from these areas, say Odisha, Jharkhand, some of these areas which are, after having noted that now we have new destinations coming up and so on and so forth, like Bangalore or people moving to the south, what he pointed out is that why hasn't this migration not led to any convergence? That means the standard economic theory which was pointing out that that's the only way through which we have convergence. In fact, what we are seeing is a persistence, aggravation of the disparity. And as Sucharita pointed out, this is a political migration. In the sense, this migration is politically induced. So so-called structural transformation, which is what all the governments want, to move people from low productivity to high productivity, which is what migration should have been doing, in fact, is not just happening. It happens through political allocation of resources or political misallocation of resources. Let's say migration flows along the gradients which have been already carved out, as Sucharita had pointed out, already carved out in our unequal society, regional, caste, or social and economic. So both the political nature of migration and its link to, and because Ravi is located in Germany, he can also reflect on what the question, how does migration throw open the question, the political question? Is migration question to be seen as a political question? Okay.
Yeah, thanks to all of you for beginning this discussion. So I'd like to talk a bit about circulation, about some of the structural features of circulation and the political implications also. So I think Shomita started basically with a comment of that unprecedented visibility of circulating labor that we've experienced now. And in our lived experience, it is a sort of unique moment. But I think there is a connection also between pandemics and circulation. Pandemics tend to make circulation more visible. And that has been there in the Indian context also for a longer time. In the 1890s, circulation from Bombay city, people fleeing the plague, was extremely visible, hit the headlines as far away as in London. And it was at that point for the first time that also the political impact of these circulatory movements became very clear. Also, circulation is not a poor country phenomenon. So it is becoming visible in different parts of the world in different ways. So the proportions differ massively. That is quite so. But the phenomenon itself is omnipresent, but in different ways, as I said. So in India, of course, as you know, so within April, so that these are figures that I found, about 90 million day laborers lost their jobs within 1 month. So not all of them were migrants, and not all migrants are day laborers. So that is not the same category, but there is a distinct overlap that we find. And migrants were mainly seen by the establishment as a risk of sort of viral infection that one needed to get, that one needed basically to regulate, to keep in place in various ways. At the same time, also in April, in Germany, in a very different kind of economic system, and is not different because of the absence of inequality. I would basically say circulating labor became also extremely visible because certain sectors of the economy couldn't function any longer. So that applied to agriculture, that applied to parts of the food processing industry, most famously the meatpacking industry, but that also applied to the massive privatized part of the care sector, where circulating mainly female labor from Eastern Europe found it more difficult to reach private households at that time, and it also affects the construction sector. So in India, it was seen, migrants were seen as a risk, basically. In Germany, circulating labor, the absence of circulating labor was seen as an economic danger, but it was visible to an absolutely unprecedented extent nevertheless. So why do we find circulating labor under so different economic regimes? Why do we actually find under all capitalist conditions circulating labor? Why is circulating labor reproduced time and again through all the historical changes of capitalism? Because the realization of capital feeds on the exploitation of difference, of wage differences and others. So that is the basic element why this reoccurs under extremely different circumstances. In India, in the late 19th century, in the early phases of industrialization is possible. Someone has switched on the mic, so now I get a bad echo. Okay. So at the beginnings of industrialization in India, this process is only possible because of the availability of circulating labor. But then, at present, so very often contemporary industries which are involved in global value chains, in dispersed production regimes, also rely on circulating labor. So this is not the same labor regime. This is something entirely different from a different historical phase. At the same time, also, the outsourcing of high-value processes, for instance, the IT industry, from countries in the West to parts of India becomes possible because cheap circulating domestic labor and construction labor is also possible that allows to lower wages also for more skilled workers in India itself. And the same applies also to the German economy. There needs to be an industrial and services underbelly in advanced capitalist economies that allows to keep wages comparatively low. So the availability of cheap care workers from Eastern Europe and putting down prices basically for construction by using circulating labor, or by being able to sell cheap meat basically and cheap foods, also is a subsidy for the wages of other parts of the workforce. So, just as circulating labor can have different economic functions, it can also have different political implications. And I think that is important actually to see at the moment. In the German meatpacking industry, we see at the moment a law in preparation for the prohibition of contract labor. Yes, contract labor also exists in Germany. So that was brought on the way at the height of the first wave of the COVID-19 crisis. We are now seeing that this legislation is in danger to being watered down, also since the bargaining position of the employees there is falling. But still, this is a process where the circulation of labor in a pandemic crisis, the problems that become visible at that lead to more regulation, lead basically to potentially social protection. And this is strangely also something we have seen with a very unorganized, in terms of trade unionism, workforce in Bombay in the 1890s, as Aditya Sakar, a young historian, has worked out and shown quite conclusively. So the beginnings of raising a social question, a worker question, thinking about the protective legislation, housing policy for workers and so on, begin with the crisis of the late 1890s in Bombay. So this is when factory owners begin to come up with welfare schemes in their factories. This is when housing schemes are being set up. And this is also, by the way, the period when essential services are being instituted and municipal workers are being robbed of their possibility of quitting their job and of going on strike. Okay, so the question of regulation of labor and of reducing mobility can come up under very different social and historical circumstances. These political outcomes are always shaped by structural economic conditions and also by relations of powers, because pandemics do not necessarily lead to any kind of social reform or more regulation, more state regulation, more formal state regulation of workers. So how about the Indian case at the moment? So the relations of power are certainly tilted at the moment against migrant workers. They don't count, quite literally. So the Indian government doesn't make much effort even to count basically the victims, as we are reading in these days. There are also first signs for a further strengthening of informal forms of employment. Already in May, when work time regulations were being abandoned for the formal sector, that's a further step towards informalization. And if we are to believe, so Sramita has mentioned that all the figures that are available are vague, and this vagueness is part of the political problem that we are actually also facing. But if we are to believe the figures provided by the Center for Monitoring in the Indian Economy, we find very interesting developments. So as I've mentioned before, 90 million of day workers' jobs appear to have been lost in April. But many of these jobs appear to have come back, or day jobs were basically reconstituted. So that it basically seems that 11 million jobs were lost basically since April among day workers. So that's still a lot, and we know that these figures are not necessarily reliable. And we see that farmers' figures appear to have gone up, whatever that actually means. That entrepreneurs' numbers have gone up, whatever that again means, because self-employed people who are also sort of circulating migrant labor, in fact, are included. But we see that salaried employees, those defined to have a regular job and get a monthly wage, basically, that 25% of their jobs have been cancelled since April. So the tendency seems to be at the moment, as far as I can see, but this is perhaps something we can discuss, that a further step in the
Okay, sorry. Now you can, Susan, you've heard most of our panelists speaking about several issues which would have echoes with what's happened in China, but also from your experiences. The striking thing about China, which I remember, is that when the pandemic happened, bulk of the workers had gone home for the New Year's, and that massive flow of migration, which was stopped, let's call it the reverse migration from the villages to the city, was stopped. And that was one of the big reasons for China's ability to contain the pandemic in some sense, and pandemic deaths. The huge number of people who went, and that's perhaps the only comparable scenario that we can imagine. Millions of people, of course, not walking home like in India, but in high-speed trains or whatever, they all went back to villages, and the estimates are about 100 million overall. But from Wuhan or Hubei province, I don't know how many millions who went home for New Year's. So at least that's a striking image. Those guys who didn't come back, and here there were people who were going back home in some ways comparable, at least in comparable magnitude. So Susan, if you can enlighten us or comment on, you can comment on each of this. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, one of the reasons. Sure. I mean, one of the reasons that so many people were at home at the moment, as you said, was because it was Chinese New Year, where most people try to get home in all years. The issue in China, however, I think, and then they were blocked from coming back, not just because the cities actually had the power to stop people leave and come back, so the city boundaries were closed, they couldn't go back, but also, and of course the factories had closed down, right? So the jobs were gone at the same time. So most migrants in China work either on construction sites or in factories, which means that, and mostly the factory labors, the jobs were closed. I suppose also the construction sites would be closed at that time. So people were stuck in the villages and couldn't go back. But I think in general, and they had then basically fall back on subsistence labor, right? Most people have very few land in China today, if at all. So they can only have plots to survive on, not to make a living on, really. But you cannot understand. I think the main difference to India is that you cannot understand anything in China without understanding the particular politics of the party, right? And what has kind of dominated the whole migration question, or which is called rural-urban migration in China, has been this kind of very particular citizen regime that socialist China under Mao Zedong installed, and which has continues in a different form to separate the urban population from the rural population. And the rural population in China is the population which owns, as they say, a rural household register, right? Where you are registered is where you are, what kind of status you are. And there was, since Mao, there was a kind of two types of citizen status in China. One was urban status, and the other one was rural status or peasant households. And because by simply moving to the city, you do not change your household status, because you cannot be registered where you would like to. But this is part of what first of all this household register system controls, and which now local governments have much more power to selectively use against rural migrants. So when people go, even if they've lived for some time, for decades in the city, they don't have a city household registration and are still called peasant workers, right? They're not only called rural migrants, they're actually called peasant workers, although they do not work as peasants, but they have a peasant household register, which meant until recently is that they did not have any right to exist in city space, right? Because in the beginning, when the whole migration started, they were not allowed. Yeah, so they were kind of semi-illegal migrants in the cities. And they had no rights to any social services. They had no rights to schooling. They had no rights to anything, to even be there. So they could be chucked out at will. So they were totally precarious, if you like. This has changed in recent years a little bit because China has become the center of the politics has now been one of urbanization for quite some time, which also means people you have, in the countryside, you have more agri-businesses who actually buy or rent the land. So, and you have the extension of cities, so more and more people are actually pushed by politics, by the politics of the local government from their plots, or they lose and they have to go to the cities. And they cannot just, don't have the same rights in the city as urban people. And since when China started its own urbanization push, the idea was that people who had spent some time in the city but couldn't bring their children because they had no right to the school in the cities, and all the problems which followed from that, and they didn't have any health insurance, they had no social security, everything was back home in the village, but the village, of course, would also not provide anything except family care, right? So what people had, there was the idea of the central government, what one had to extend the social services and open up urban spaces also in terms of rights to rural migrants. And this is something which maybe has started 10 years ago, 15 years ago. However, the situation is still like this, that most of that is kind of a policy which is presented as an ideal, but in reality, local governments remain very much in charge of whom they're going to accept. And even if they do provide possibilities for rural migrants to register as urbanized and have access to schooling and other kind of housing and other forms of small social service or even health insurance in the cities, normally they would say that you have to fulfill a certain point system, right? To actually, not everyone could, but you have to have been here in this urban area for a couple of years. You have to have a certain educational status. You have to invest certain kinds of money. So there is this, and every government, so say, is able to make its own kind of policies about whom to accept or not. And many of these policies are only made for keeping people out of the system. So they came up with a point system which most rural migrants will never be able to fulfill, right? Because, for example, if you have a high school diploma, if you have come from the university, of course you have it quite easy. But if you don't have any of this, and you do have any precarious labor, blue collar, and so on labor, you cannot fulfill this. So you still depend basically on, if you get ill, you depend on your family back home, and if you don't have food, you might have to go back home because then you don't have money, you can't buy food anymore, you have to go back home and actually depend on the plot you still might have. And this is even getting worse by the fact that, and that's also why some people don't want to change to the urban area, because they're so afraid, because the moment they change, they can't keep their land at home, right? So that would mean they would lose any rights to the land. And because people have to, and in situations like this, need that kind of subsistence plot to survive. Many people are afraid that the worst thing would be that you are kind of a unlearned rural migrant, blue collar, without actually having an urban household registration, which might not mean anything to you, but you actually have also lost your subsistence plot. So you have virtually nothing, right? So, and that kind of particular citizen regime which Mao installed in the 60s in order to control people's movements, that has been maintained because it saves rural urban governments a lot of money, right? Because you don't have to pay for these people and you can send them home if you want to, right? And this is the basis of a kind of secondary citizenship, right? For rural people anyhow, but then you now you even have differences between rural people depending on whether they have so many points that they could make it to urban, or whether they actually have no points and have still no right to be in urban spaces. So it's really hard to understand anything in China if you don't understand the importance of the policies and the laws by the central state and the possibilities of local government to interpret them as they wish. And maybe one more word, I think also one which makes China very particular is that I think if you want to understand migration in China, you must understand also the party, as I said, the party state and its policies. But you also need to understand the policy or the regime, the family regime, right, of Chinese families. So that one of the particularities in China was that when industrialization started, both in Taiwan and in the People's Republic, there was no change, no difference, was that the major number of migrants.
Absolutely. Thank you, Susan. Fantastic. It fits in many of the things we are talking about the question of political nature of migration, and most clearly seen, as you say, in graded citizenship, differential citizenship. In the point system, you could have differential citizenship. In our case, in India, we have a wholesale exclusion of people from basic citizenship rights of life and dignity, life and livelihood, which we saw it happening. The denial of food or ration, even when they are given as by the state, the way these exclusions were played out in the cities created exactly similar systems of. And secondly, which is a point which I think many would agree. I think my co-panelists would agree, but they may that migration and in this case large-scale circulation of labor is a concrete means of subsidizing capitalist capital. In your case, for instance, the local governments, the urban governments. Urban city planners, city formations are subsidized by through the process of cheapening. This was an insight which was there in the 60s, but had got lost in the idea that migration under the new neoliberal regime actually is something which is a good thing. In case of India, it was said that we have moved from indenture, which was the character of migration earlier, to adventure. The idea that migration is about aspiration. One doesn't deny that migration is about aspiration, but we see the dark side of that. That the aspirational migration is always connected with this the lack of integration, lack of what you call lack of citizenship status, and that's why I think the question of migration and citizenship, as it happened in India. The huge pandemic movement came immediately after a large protest movement, or in one of the most amazing protest movement which happened in India, was in trying to reclaim citizenship, to redefine citizenship, which has been or to reclaim the values of constitutional citizenship. And we saw one aspect of it that based on religious discriminations or ethnic discriminations. But here we saw it directly as economic discriminations and discrimination of due to the fact that they are not fixed laborers. They have. So some of the questions I'll now take up questions, and one interesting set of questions has come from two speakers two participants who have asked, like simply speaking, how long will we keep on calling these people migrants? And so I think what they are meaning by that it is absolutely wrong to say that, in fact, by calling them migrant, we are already somehow putting them into a different status. And that is, so both Lokesh and Uma Ganjaya asked this question. How long would we keep on calling them? Why not just call them working class? Why do you keep on calling them migrant? So that's one set of questions. Okay. So another question is about whether you see the urban-rural migrant, given that, do you see that many of the workers coming back and working in the same jobs which they were doing earlier? Or do you see the possibility of return migrants through their learned skills contribute to the economy in their native? So the double thing, on the one side, people coming from the villages are returning back to work in their older or where they worked in the urban economy or urban areas, and what's the possibility of regeneration or Samita said the rural economy cannot absorb. Obviously, that's the reason. But is it so bleak, or is it really, or is it such a given? Is it a possibility of regeneration of agrarian economy in order to perhaps an alternative patterns can be imagined at least now, instead of this one-sided pattern of people coming? Only way of moving is from moving to the countryside to city. So these are the two sets of questions. Should we call them migrants, or should we? So if there are no more questions, I would ask other people to ask questions. I will ask my panelists to have like 1 minute each to reflect on these two broad areas. The questions have come. So the question, I'll just wait for a second, or at least I'll ask to begin with. Samita, to these two questions. Why should, maybe you are able to read this, the question of migrants, we call them migrants. Yeah.
Yeah. So very briefly, I would respond to whether we should call them the migrant question by linking it to the citizenship question. I think there is a political value in continuing to call people migrant if by migration they lose an aspect of their citizenship. So this is in a sense, to keep that flag flying. And they do, because part of, the resonance from Suzanne's presentation was that a lot of these people are in fact disenfranchised in the urban context into which they migrate in their destination. So they have local government voting rights in the villages from which they come, but do not have commensurate local government voting rights in the cities. So the cities to provide services, cities are not accountable to them to provide services. So they remain frozen in a migrant status in the city. And if we politically to address some of the questions of how migrants live in the city, we need to address the basic citizenship question of where they vote, what is the meaning of that vote, and what kind of services they can demand as a result of that vote. So I would not rush to, I agree, I understand where you're coming from in the question that, why should you call people migrant if they're migrating in the same place for a couple of generations, and if they have deep roots of settlements in the urban area into which they're migrating. But there is
Yeah, well, I agree. As far as the I think different kinds of migrants, some are observable than others. There is however, I do absolutely agree that by calling them migrants, there is an opportunity to politically lobby for their rights. By actually, pretending that they belong to the urban workspaces. And here I would like to mention that there is, from my work on the peri-urban areas where most of the investments and the new jobs come, peri-urban areas of the large metropolitan cities, I have observed through fieldwork in at least 2 of the cities where the employers refuse to keep the local workers. So they prefer migrants so that they don't have bargaining rights, they do not have a house there, they are absolutely vulnerable, and they are forced to kind of work in whatever circumstances they are made to. And this also ties up with the labor rights. I forgot to talk about that. There are these, the second part of the question, which probably you flagged, is whether they can use their skills back in the native places. I don't think that the opportunity for that is there as of now, because on the one hand, one very healthy way would have been for the agricultural sector to have done well, and the surpluses of that to have been invested in the non-farm sector in the rural areas. This is not happening. So, and neither are the investments flowing to the other investments are flowing to the rural areas. So I do not think that there is, no matter what you talk about agriculture, it has been the single major accommodator for for employment, whether it is underemployment, disguised employment, whatever, whereas jobs have not been created in such a big number in the urban areas, even though the growth rates have been very much faster, barring what is happening now. So I don't think those skills can be used, and I think the way the 3 policies which I would like to flag, which has happened right now during post-pandemic, one is the new education. All of these I feel are related. New education policy. The second one is the EIA, which is still at the environmental impact assessment. And the third is the change in the labor laws, which is much more direct. Now, all of these 3 together disempower the possibility. For example, the EIA cuts people off from their roots of livelihood based on natural resources, the way it has gone. The labor laws, at least in UP and MP, as you have seen, have stripped them out of the labor rights. So they have a very vulnerable position in the urban area where they're working, and on the other hand, they're very little to depend on by way of high wage rates or something in the agricultural area, and inability to apply their skills there. And there are some questions on women's labor force participation, but
you can.
Yeah, we'll talk about it later.
If you want to quickly.
One of the reasons why it is low per se in South Asia as such is the way in which women's work and the gender division of work is such that it gets missed out and it doesn't get counted as work. So even if you look within South Asia, Nepal and India, Nepal's work participation rates are much higher because they count a collection of fodder and fuel and water as work. So that it's very, very much higher. So it's much lower. But the more disturbing factor is the consistent defeminization in India, particularly in rural area, also in urban areas, but in a much more fluctuating manner. So women over a period of time, particularly after the late 90s, have been thrown out of the what is counted as work. And there are multiple reasons for this. One is, and 2 of them are actually related to the pandemic situation. The first one is that, as I was saying, there was already a phenomenon of men partially going back to agriculture because of lack of income in the urban workspaces. This is one of the reasons where women were losing their limited jobs which are available. And the second is their work related to common property resources, which is highly being privatized and statized both, have made it more difficult for the poorer women to collect fodder, fuel and water outside the house premises, and that burden has increased. And it is counterintuitive to think like that, because if you, I mean, but that is the case in fact. So, so basically what has happened, and the other thing, important thing is there is along with the falling of work participation rate, there is an increase in unemployment rate of women. So it's not as if they don't want work. More of them are in the labor force and not getting the kind of work that they can do or they might do. So
yeah. Ravi, quickly, if you can. So.
Perhaps adding to that, okay, should I? Perhaps adding to this point of citizenship. Okay. So what we heard about China, basically this sort of systematic system of differential citizenship that is created by separating the countryside from the city, is of course also a system that has made China extremely interesting for the investment of companies. So because these are partly disenfranchised workers, which are more easy also to subordinate and also to get rid of. So that's a particularly systematic case, but we find these cases of differential citizens' rights across the world, and again across periods, in a more sort of unsystematic way, unorderly way. In India, so as most of the participants know, so the question of interstate migration is the main mechanism of differential citizenship rights, which has played out during the pandemic now, which has created reduced rights, lower social status in the cities, where the migrant issue actually matters, as Shomita basically has said. So if we go on basically to Germany, so the meatpacking industry works in a similar way. So if migrant workers there are from non-EU companies, non-EU countries, their right to residence is linked to their work contract. If they are from EU countries, so then they have a right of residence, so they even have a right to participate in municipal elections, but they have reduced entitlements of social protection, which are also impact on their contractual relationships. So it's exactly these differentials in citizenship status, which can be graded. So it does not have to be one on the one side and one on the other. It can be
quickly on the Susan, can you hear me? Okay.
I think, I mean, that these people are talked about in different ways as urbanites is basically a factor also of the citizen regime, which means that they are, as I said, in China, are still called they're called peasant workers, right? Although they're not working as peasants at all, but they still are of peasant household risk. That was a particular type of citizenship, peasant citizenship, which are different from workers' citizenship and urban citizenship, right? So I think that the fact that their rights are so different to urban space and to social security and to housing, etc., in urban areas is, I think, the reason why one could continue to call them rural urban migrants, also because they go back and forth as other people do in other countries. Yes, and I think one thing I would still like to add is that the reason why people like to invest so much in China is not just the citizen regime, but also the general fact that all forms of labor organization are forbidden, which are not controlled by the party. All forms of social movement are forbidden in China, right? So everything, you still have kind of formal labor unions, but they are not working for the workers. They're working for the party, right? So there is this kind of very particular situation in China coming from the fact they do not have any voting rights, but no one has voting rights in China in any kind of meaningful sense, right? They can vote in the villages, but then even these kind of elections tend to be controlled somewhere or the other. So that is the main reason. You can't protest, you can't do anything, you can't organize. Of course, you do have labor protests in China still, but they are formally illegal. You don't even have to deal with the demands because the protest itself is illegal. One thing, however, I think makes China particularly different and also special is that, and that's my own kind of impression, if you like, that's kind of unchecked, but I have sometimes the feeling that just by the fact that you have a one-party system in China, the government is far more nervous of social unrest happening in China and about its own legitimacy, right? So the Chinese government does actually react on forms of unrest and forms of kind of charges of not caring about workers or peasants anymore, since they are still a communist party. This is still a communist party, and they supposedly should look after the workers and the peasants. But at the least, they are the least people they're actually looking after. But it still makes it very vulnerable to these kind of charges.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. I suppose I think it brings back even in a question which is always lingering in my mind, and following from this, is the migrant status, by calling them migrant, do we take away their agency in some sense? But it would seem that if we had alongside the utter plight, so-called plight of migrant workers that we saw, if we had put together also the resistance of the workers, the map of resistance of workers, some people have, I wish I could show it, was even in this short period, we should be looking at how the workers, they were resisting and how they were transforming. So even just to give an example to support Susan's point, not because only of the question of legitimacy, the government had to, for instance, after all this, had to change back certain restrictions, had to initiate the travel, for instance, after having dilly-dallied for a long time. It still had to make the workers go by train, for instance, to start a train. There were several, those were results not of the gift of the state, but because of the, in some sense, because of the protest and resistance by workers. So I would like to, this is a theme which we didn't deal with much, but I think it is embedded in the way we should be not looking at migrants merely as objects moved by state actions and suffering economic deprivations, but as a thinking, feeling human being, which is one of the things that I think the migrant crisis in India has put forward. I would end by thanking, unless there are some other questions, I think none. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mike. It is my pleasure to have been with you, and so many questions which I didn't know where it would have gone. I think it was a wonderful learning process for me, and hope it was for the audience also. Thank you, Samita. Thank you, Sucharita. Thank you, Ravi, and thank you, Susan. And thank you, Adishri and Tanya and Gorima for organizing this. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Are you going to speak, Adishri? Okay.
Sorry, I had another setting on my microphone that I needed to. Yeah, I just wanted to thank you also from us at the DWIH for a really nice discussion from a lot of perspectives, and which was really necessary to bring it out. Thanks from the audience also for their questions, and also to the people who helped us organize this. I was very glad to have you all on the panel. I would like to just ask the speakers to stay back a little bit for a short feedback session right at the end, along with the other organizers that we had from your respective universities or partners. And now I would ask the participants to just help us quickly with a short poll on as a feedback to let us know how do they like the session, if there's any other topic on this that they would like us to pick up for further questions. And the chat window would be open for another, let's say, 5 minutes. This webinar has been recorded, and it will be available for you on our website in the coming days for you to reference. And we will also put in there links to the works of the speakers here so that you can refer to it, read it, and on that note. And also please join us tomorrow, which is the last day of this web talk series, as we explore the digitalization rush, especially in research and research institutes and universities, and how it has affected the Indo-German cooperation, and what are the new ways that have come out in terms of digital research, telework, and education sector. So please join us tomorrow, same time. And yeah, the poll is here. We will close the poll in a couple of seconds. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for your engagement. Final inputs in the chat if someone still wants to comment, or if the speakers do want to also leave links to their home pages or to their work, you can do that at this point of time. We will close the chat session in about 2 minutes.